Many people in Boston are looking forward to better service on the MBTA with new stops on the Fairmount Indigo line. The line goes all the way from Reedville to South Station, with a new stop recently opened in Dorchester at Talbot Avenue. In the long run, the hope is to have a new rapid transit line with comparable schedule and prices. In the meantime, there's an effort to make the best of the service and its potential for new development while minimizing the downside. That's the reason for a grant recently made to nonprofit community development groups by the TD Charitable Foundation. Our guest is from one of those groups, the Executive Director of Southwest Boston CDC, Mike Feloney. Thank you very much for being with us, Mike.
Thank you for having me.
First of all, talk about the area where your group is active in Hyde Park and what this means for people in that part of Boston.
Sure. Southwest Boston CDC actually serves Hyde Park and Roslindale, but the bulk of our work in Hyde Park these days does really revolve around the Fairmount Indigo corridor, which refers to the Fairmount commuter line as it's currently known. And what the TD Foundation grant really means in most immediate terms for Southwest Boston CDC is that we can continue the goals of the Fairmount Collaborative, which are really threefold. The first being to help create vibrant, urban, sustainable villages that are accessible to public transit and really can help revitalize some of the areas in closest proximity to either existing or new stations being created along the Fairmount line. In Hyde Park, there are 2 existing stations, and particularly where we're focused now is near the Fairmount station, where there are a number of underutilized parcels that we think would really lend themselves to a variety of uses that could benefit the neighborhood and neighborhoods along the corridor. Those include affordable and mixed income housing uses, business uses, both commercial and retail, and open space. We are hoping to create a network of open spaces along and throughout the corridor, and finally to encourage economic development through jobs and commercial development.
If you think of what that part of Hyde Park around Fairmount Station used to be like, it was sort of like the back end. You had Lewis Chemical there,
exactly.
Industrial things. You wouldn't want to live too close to it.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And we really feel like there's sort of a confluence of factors and circumstances now with the support of TD Foundation and other funding sources really are going to position us and other community-based organizations to really revitalize uses that at one point in time people just stayed away from. Lewis Chemical being a perfect example of what was once upon a time a tannery in its original form, eventually was converted to use as a hazardous waste treatment plant, and ironically enough was shut down by the State Department of Environmental Protection.
And this is right next to the Neponset River too.
Exactly, virtually on the banks of the Neponset. But at the same time, while that was eventually shut down primarily through the work of neighborhood residents and other folks who organized to have Lewis Chemical cease operations in the 1980s, was then eventually taken over by the city of Boston due to back taxes. And now through a series of grants, both from the federal government and most recently a grant, apart from the one that we're talking about today, a grant announced by the Lieutenant Governor just 2 weeks ago, the state is also now investing resources to continue cleanup of Lewis Chemical. And the point you made about it being right next to the Neponset is key, because what was once, sort of logical commercial use near the energy source of the river really could lend itself to some wonderful other uses. There will be restrictions on the kinds of uses given that there was previously hazardous waste on the site, but once the cleanup can be done to a sufficient level, at least some sort of use that's beneficial to the neighborhood rather than a blight will be possible.
As you mentioned, Hyde Park has 2 heavy rail stops on 2 different lines, plus there's a stop in Reedville. So instead of thinking of this as a way for people from Hyde Park, Reedville, and possibly Roslindale to get downtown, it's also for people maybe moving in the opposite direction toward jobs.
You're absolutely correct, and that's really part of the vision of the Fairmount Corridor. And while the immediate opportunities do seem to be somewhat focused around Fairmount Station, there are also, eventually we believe, tremendous opportunities for job-creating kinds of uses around Reedville. Reedville Yards being about 37 acres in size. There are other uses now that are somewhat in transition, a former Stop and Shop warehouse, and numerous other sites. Also, again, ones that could lend themselves to open space creation. You know, there's a little-known pond that you may be familiar with, Sprague Pond.
On the border of Dedham there, right?
Not far from Reedville, or not far from the Reedville stop, I should say. And again, it's sort of a hidden potential jewel. So there's a lot of work to be done, but a lot of opportunity too.
I know you have plenty of people using rail service in Hyde Park and Reedville right now, but if this service becomes more attractive, I can also imagine more people, not just from these neighborhoods, looking for a place to park and get on the train.
Exactly, and we really feel like this is an area where people with different sorts of interests and priorities really can sort of come together. One example is we rent our space from one of our office space, that is, from a realty company, and I've had conversations with the owner of Tierney Realty Group, who says, boy, if we could get equitable and better service on the Fairmount line, this would be an area that a lot of people would consider buying in that currently now wouldn't, just because it's not accessible to downtown, or as you suggested, vice versa.
One other issue here is the price of this service, because closer to downtown it would be as cheap as rapid transit, but in Hyde Park and Reedville right now, that's not the case.
Exactly, and that's why we have undertaken a campaign of sorts that we're calling Fair Fares for Fairmount. And what we mean by that is when you go from the Morton Street station immediately north of Hyde Park, you're paying based on being in one transit zone as it's currently defined by the MBTA. But when you cross zones, the fares go from what you just said, Chris, at $2 currently to $5.50 for one way. And to just demonstrate the sort of immediate impact that has, I see it every day in the person of our own office manager who lives in Dorchester, right near the Morton Street station. She could be to work in 5 minutes, literally, if she could afford taking the Fairmount line. Instead, she takes 2 buses, and it's a 50-minute commute.
All right, well, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.
Mike Feloney from the Southwest Boston and CDC.